All right. Thank you, Carolina, Natalie, Stefan, Rainer, and of course, Alexandra. We have upcoming a very, very interesting talk about the Apple Track Transparency. With me on the stage in a few seconds will be Professor Thomas Höppner, who is one of Europe's leading competition lawyers and has held tech giants responsible for various cases. He is a partner at the law firm Hausfeld in Berlin, and the company is specializing in competition law and digital markets. He has led, like I just said, advertising-related complaints against Apple, Google, and other companies, leading to penalties in the excess of 6 billion euros so far. In 2023, he also published his new book, Digital Advertising in the Google Ecosystem, and he will now share with us insights on the app tracking transparency from Apple and how Apple introduced a measurement to enhance privacy, while competition authorities now are starting their complaints and are assessing whether AT&T in fact constitutes an abuse of Apple's mobile dominance. The Apple tracking content has definitely shifted the power in the advertising industry and impacted advertisers significantly. And Professor Höppner will now go into the impact and legal consequences in that matter and how this might change in the future for third parties relying on data from Apple. Welcome, Professor Höppner, on stage.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to speak about Apple ATT today. Now, as has already been summarized, I will try to outline what ATT is all about, how it impacted the entire digital ecosystem, and how it should be assessed or could be assessed through the lens of competition law. What is it about? Now, you will be aware that internet consumption moved into mobile devices. You will also be aware that basically mobile devices is divided into two players, their Android devices and then their iOS devices of Apple. And currently, Apple has a share of around 30% globally. What makes Apple particular in this respect is that it's an entirely walled-off ecosystem. Apple alone determines who gets on the phone and what business they can pursue. So this raises several questions. Is actually competition in such an ecosystem possible? Certainly yes, we've seen that. But what happens if the one that controls that ecosystem decides that it only favors certain types of competition? And that is what this investigation into Apple ATT is really about. From a broader perspective, we can see the interests of advertisers and publishers in a fair level playing field on iOS devices. They want to compete with access to data that they require to do their job. From a consumer's perspective, well, they want a broad choice. They want many apps on the App Store, and ideally, they don't want to pay for all the apps ever so more. From a society perspective, we also want a vivid ecosystem with many apps available, with broad plurality, because that is beneficial. And from a technical perspective, this ATT topic is really about data. So the combining element of all these three elements I spoke earlier on, competition, consumer interest, society, comes down to data. Because data is such an essential element, as we are discussing these 2 days, for this ecosystem, that who controls data controls competition within. You will be all aware of the relevance of data in this area. We don't just need it for targeting, we need it for attribution, verification, ad fraud prevention. We need it to really tailor products, to finance apps, to bring down the costs for consumers, because you have personalized advertising that pays for the apps. And all these benefits of data need to be appreciated. And sometimes we forget about it, and we only focus on the downsides. And we think everything that is connected with a collection of data must be bad because it somehow infringes privacy. But in reality, data can create huge efficiencies of which consumers benefit hugely. So what is the current mechanism to collect such data that is required for the ecosystem? You will be aware that on desktop devices, this is the cookie. We've talked about that earlier on already. And on mobile devices, the technical tool are identifiers. So in the case of Apple, we are talking about the IDFA. In the case of Android, the AAID. And you will also be aware of the fact that the gatekeepers, however, have pursued some strategies to limit the access to such data through measures such as the Privacy Sandbox and Apple ATT, but also through measures such as the Apple Intelligent Tracking Prevention, which even limits first-party data. ATT in particular is about access to the identifier on Apple devices, which is the first requirement to combine data. How is that access now limited? Prior to ATT, every publisher needed to get consent from their users to combine any data. It was required to do so under European data protection law, and there was no question about it. If you didn't do it, Apple could not allow you to the App Store, or you could be sued for data protection infringements. So that was a given. Everyone had to apply to it. To get such consent, you had to inform your user about what you're doing, how you use the data, for which purposes you use it. It has to be an informed choice. What we see now with Apple ATT is that Apple in April 2021 decided this consent as required under data protection law is not sufficient on Apple devices. We imposed the obligation on app developers to require a second consent. Otherwise, they will not be permitted to the App Store. And to get that consent, they have to use the architecture, the prompt design that Apple provides. There's a bit of fine-tuning, but we will see later on that this is very limited. Too limited to really inform the user in a sophisticated way and provide a good choice. This mechanism is really unrelated to data protection law because, in fact, even if you get a consent through this mechanism, this is not sufficient to comply with GDPR simply because you haven't informed the user enough. So we will talk about later on what the actual purpose then is. Let's have a look at it first. If you look at the design, it's rather obvious that Apple has created an architecture that really incentivizes the user to reject what Apple defines as tracking, the combination of data. This can be concluded from the biases that Apple exploits. Most important bias that it exploits is this sheer framing, how the prompt is framed. You see the word tracking there. Now, users don't understand the word tracking, but they associate it with something negative. It has a negative connotation. More importantly, the choice that is seemingly given is between I want to be tracked or I don't want to be tracked. But in both ways, I get my product. Well, as a user, it's rather obvious that I rather don't want to be tracked and get the same product than being tracked and get the same product. Where's the disadvantage? It's not explained. So the choices that are given are actually not presenting the reality. Another trick they are using is a bias called a primacy bias, which is basically that you give the choice that you want the user to make as the first option. So here it is, ask the app not to track. This is the first that users see, and the chances are that's the first they click. And the third trick then is that the part that app developers cannot change, the bold heading, that is really the one that is kind of more of a warning sign. And the part that they can adjust, the customizable section below, is so small that many users are not even reading through it. The second issue is, while this prompt is designed to kind of disencourage users to allow tracking, it also disables app developers from creating their own incentives for users to opt in, to give incentives such as showing the advantages of such combination of data, even though data protection law clearly allows to give such incentives. What is the outcome of that? Well, as expected, the majority reacted the way Apple anticipated it and rejected the tracking. The degree of rejection varies from market and industry, but on average, it is around 50 to 60%. It was higher in the first month than it is now. And to see this in comparison, if publishers inform their users directly, then they on average get a consent rate of 75%. So in effect, Apple ATT has reversed the probability that the user agrees to such data usage. Now, what's the impact? Very clearly, Apple ATT impacted everyone in the ecosystem, and nearly everyone in the bad way. Publishers earned less with their apps, advertisers had higher costs to reach their audiences, and intermediaries couldn't do their job anymore without data. There were some that benefited, however, those that don't rely on third-party data, primarily search-based advertising. So the success of Amazon's retail media, for instance, can be linked to Apple ATT because budgets shifted off to those platforms where targeting still works. Even large parties, large platforms with access to first-party data suffered, as you will have witnessed in the case of Meta, Snapchat, or Twitter. So it's not that first-party data is safe from this, they will also be impacted. However, by far the largest beneficiary is Apple itself, in many ways. Firstly, the sale of their own search-based ads, the App Store ads, went through the roof. Secondly, they increased the revenue share that they get from search ads on Google, because as you may know, there is a revenue share agreement with Google, so the more money Google makes on iOS devices with search advertising, the more it can hand over to Apple. It renders some 12 billion a year to Apple, pure profit. Thirdly, now Apple doesn't earn anything from ad-financed apps, but it earns a commission of 15 to 30% if it's a subscription-based app. So Apple has a clear incentive to increase the percentage of subscription-based apps, because the more apps feel the need to charge users, the more Apple earns. And fourthly, because Apple ATT has kind of blindfolded every intermediary in the system, automatically, in contrast, its own measuring and attribution service, SCAD network, increased its relevance and became sort of the standard must-have tool, which in turn allowed Apple to kind of show and do its own homework in a more favorable way. The Competition Authority of UK, United Kingdom, has already summarized the impact rather well in this slide. So because of ATT, ad networks cannot attribute conversions anymore, and it's impossible to identify valuable users. So there's a lot of wastage, which increases acquisition costs and leads to lower revenues for apps, forcing them to then charge end users. This can be seen also from the figures. The average price, the CPM, for traffic without access to an identifier is half as high as for traffic with an identifier. And you will all have witnessed that large companies even suffered substantial losses because they can't personalize the ads anymore. But what has been lost in this debate is that smaller companies are even more dependent on it and may have lost even more in percentage to their overall revenues. The degree of that varied from country to country. What is clear, however, Apple entered the ad business at the same time as it launched ATT with new ad formats, primarily search ads on Apple App Store, but also apps for the recommendation of apps, which is similar to display advertising. And it has increased its own workforce around advertising. Here's a sign what impact that has. It shows the share of uploads, or I should say downloads of apps triggered by an ad by Apple. So here, an app in the App Store. And the rate increased significantly after ATT, which means that more and more apps felt the need to launch and buy apps in the App Store from Apple to remain visible. Some expect that this will increase even more over the next years and that Apple's revenues may go up to 30 billion from advertising up to 2026. A significant growth, which is understandable because the sale of their devices kind of stagnates, so they need a new revenue stream for growth, and the services element, including advertising, is key to this. Another evidence that ATT primarily affects display advertising rather than search can be seen from this comparison between the growth of search, Google search, and YouTube. The same company had different developments here. While prior to ATT, YouTube grew faster than search, after ATT, it was the other way around, indicating that YouTube, that is subject to the effects of ATT, suffered more than search, which indirectly benefits from ATT. So let's come back to the legal element. First question, is this really about enhancing privacy? That is Apple's primary storyline. They want to enable users, give them more choice and an easier option to have privacy. However, we should not forget that even without Apple ATT, every publisher is obliged under current law to get such consent to combine data. And if it's true that European law is the strictest in the world in this respect, then do we really need an additional requirement by ATT, which ironically doesn't even fulfill the requirements of the GDPR because it doesn't sufficiently inform users? Secondly, Apple claims that it's not tracking itself and the combination of third parties, that's the real evil. But that's only because of the definition that Apple chose for tracking. Under this definition, tracking is only present if data is combined between independent entities, while there is no tracking if data is combined between companies within the same group. So while it is seen as tracking in Apple's definition, if a small app shares its data with an ad intermediary, let's say for the purpose of measuring the effects of a campaign, it is not tracking under Apple's definition if Apple itself combines data from the App Store, from the Safari browser with Apple News and Apple TV. Huge amounts of data. Now, I would say that the risk actually for privacy is much higher with one company amassing all that data in one hand than the smaller players. Because with the smaller players, you as a user can say, well, it's a bit dodgy, I'm not using this service. But with the large players, some of them have unavoidable services. So you can't just say, well, I'm not having it, because then you can't use half of the services you got to use and like. Another legal question is it really acceptable that Apple says, well, if you don't get a consent from users, you still have to combine data, you still have to provide that service to our users. I would say no, that's not acceptable, because data protection law allows to create incentives to give consent. And it also allows that you say as well, if you don't pay and you don't accept to share any data about you that enables my personalized advertising, my business model, well, then you simply can't use my service, because then how else am I supposed to make money? Next thing, if Apple was really so convinced about this enhancing privacy, why is it not applying to its own service the same mechanism? It is not, because up until 2021, it was even by default on Apple devices that Apple itself can have personalized advertising, so track, combine data within. That led to the French privacy watchdog to fine Apple because it is not compliant with European data protection law. Now, Apple changed that in September 2021, but even now we see that it treats its own mechanism to get permission for personalized advertising different to how it treats third parties. You can see that from the prompts. Now, the prompts are very different when it comes to using biases. Because if you read through the description of Apple's own prompt, it's all positive, outlining the benefits of personal advertising, saying that they wouldn't track themselves, giving reassurances, and all the rest of it. While if you compare that with the prompt for ATT, you hardly get anything positive out of it. It's more of the warning sign. Also, if you look at the options given, so with ATT, the first option is disallow. With their own prompt, the first option is allow. So you can see how they use behavioral economics to make sure third parties don't get approval, but Apple itself does. Now, there's a long list established by the Competition Authority of UK that compares these two elements and points out, look, you are not treating the same thing the same way. Let's come back a bit to the legal elements. There is no evidence that enforcement of privacy law is failing. I know many see this differently, but we wouldn't have so many lawyers in the room discussing this thing if privacy laws played no role. Companies try to adhere to the law, and there are consequences if they don't. But even if we assumed there was some deficiency in enforcement, would that entitle a private company like Apple to then play kind of the sheriff to say, well, we are now making sure that these loopholes are closed? The clear answer from the case law is no. Because it is not acceptable that a private company, rather than a public authority, enforces the law. That's the job of public authorities. So they cannot justify a conduct that limits competition with the argument, well, we just kind of help out the public authorities that fail to enforce the current law. There's a long case line on that because many companies before have tried this trick, justifying limitations of competition with apparent security benefits. This whole aspect led to various investigations. So we have currently competition investigations in France, Poland, Germany, and since 2 weeks now in Italy regarding Apple ATT. There has also been a very strong criticism on this aspect by the British Competition Authority. At the core of it is the element of self-preferencing. So Apple designed these prompts and the architecture of the consent scheme in a way that its own advertising model is favored and those of others are disfavored. And there is also an element of pure hindering. By hindering ad-financed apps, it is promoting its own business because people feel the need to shift then to subscription-based ads. To give you an impression how long these proceedings take, in Germany, the complaint of a vast group of associations representing all sides of the ecosystem, publishers, advertisers, intermediaries, brands. They submitted a complaint as early as April 2021, but still we haven't seen a decision yet or a statement of objection. It is complex indeed, and Apple is certainly throwing a lot of resources in these cases. But at least my hope would be that in the next month or so, we will see something more formal. What we have seen, however, is the first indication how the Bundeskartellamt, the German competition authority, considers these elements. So in this press release of Andreas Mund, he focuses on the aspect that Apple more or less exploits its power to unilaterally set rules within its ecosystem. And this rule-making power, of course, creates strong incentives to exploit it in a way that you kind of design businesses and business models in your own interest. And so far, he concluded that we have reason to doubt that the current design is pro-competitive. It could allow Apple to give preference to its own offers and impede other companies. It is unlikely that this will, in the end, lead to a total ban of the ATT framework rather than a fine-tuning. But the core question will remain, do those competition authorities realize this is not, at least not just and not primarily, about enhancing users' privacy, but it's actually using privacy as a disguise, as a cover-up to actually reduce competition in favor of Apple's own business model. What are the key takeaways? I think we've seen that Apple, and the same applies to Google in this matter, have the ability to really shift entire markets by the way they allow access to data. And these shifts can have fundamental consequences. And unfortunately, these two players have strong incentives to use that power in their own favor because obviously they want to increase their revenues. And Apple in particular, given that their sales are stagnating and they need more revenues from subscriptions and the commissions that go along with it, or from revenues from advertising, has a particularly strong incentives. And we need to realize that there are, of course, tensions between competition and privacy, and that some measures that may be presented as contributions to enhance privacy may actually be measures to limit competition. And it's upon the competition authorities, but also the privacy authorities, to dig deep into it and to assess, is this really enhancing privacy, or is this actually detrimental for it because it leads to a further concentration of data and power in the hands of a few. Thank you for your time.
Wow, I'm very impressed. I thought Apple had the very bright minds, but apparently they're here on stage. Before we start into our lunch break, we actually wanted to also give you guys the opportunity to ask questions. Thomas will still be here on stage now. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please raise your hand. We have a microphone going around again, and I saw that you already trained in the panel before. Any questions? Ah, there's a gentleman over there.
I can speak loud, so just Malik from Virtual Minds. Very short question. You mentioned the consent rate overall is below 50% of Apple's ATT. Does this differ a lot between countries? Was the 46%, was it a German number, or was it like globally or European-wide, or how does this differ between countries?
Yes, now I can give you the latest figure. It will only be published this Friday. That's why I couldn't include it in the presentation. It's an empirical study by 3 professors from the University of Düsseldorf. And it's about the impact of ATT. And they have assessed it across several countries, but I can remember exactly the figures for Germany. And there they saw that the percentage of trackable traffic on Apple devices prior to ATT was 80%, and it now dropped to 26%, which meant a loss of trackable traffic, which is important to personalize your ads, for instance, by 60%. They also concluded and assessed that this led to loss of revenues for ad-financed apps on average by 20%, so a significant loss. And they also concluded that there are no means for publishers to compensate that by any effort to get more consent or whatever efforts they may have in mind. So this is a precise study. What you mentioned with country to country, there was one slide, you can look it up later on, that identified that in some countries there's a higher percentage of rejection than in others. It may have to do with basically the feeling and the sense of urgency regarding privacy issues. So in some countries, privacy is a bigger topic than in others. So it's not identical, but based on this latest study, it is more along the lines of some 60, maybe 50% of a drop than below that. So for sure, it's a significant shift.
We have a lot of marketeers also in the room. And I wonder, do you have any advice for marketeers what they should do? I mean, you want to reach Apple users, obviously. They have an above average household income, according to Booking.com, showing them more 5-star hotels than others. So it's a very sweet spot, Apple users. And if it gets more difficult, so what kind of advice would you give to marketeers if they do not want to sue Apple, which is almost impossible, right? So what can you do?
That is a very good question, and probably the time's not enough to answer it comprehensively, because we know about the various channels you could use as a marketeer to get there. But your starting point is correct. The ecosystem around iOS devices is particularly interesting because usually higher education, higher income, higher engagement, more spending through those devices than on Android, at least in some countries. There's a shift in that. But yes, it is an audience you can't afford to miss. And then we are back to the general questions. How do you want to reach the audience? Well, we've got the three kind of different channels. You've got search without any kind of need to data access, and then you have got display, and then we are talking about context or behavioral. Now we know context advertising is very limited for reasons that are rather obvious. Your content defines how you can market your site, and some content just doesn't lend itself for proper advertising. So we are back to behavioral. And when it comes to behavioral, we need the data. And yes, we've seen from Apple ATT, but also from the Google Privacy Sandbox, how vulnerable this business is, because these players can limit access to data that you would need for behavioral advertising. So the consequence then would be you need to try to become more independent regarding your data sources. You try to diversify access to data and use kind of every technology and element that's out there to get to the sweet spot to enable you to actually target and do the other functionalities that proper marketing require. So I think diversification using new technologies such as those you were presenting tomorrow is, I think, the right way forward. You need to reduce the dependency because otherwise you may not be able to react in time to counter measures such as these.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, over there.
Let me be a bit provocative. am I right to interpret this new feature of App Store to introduce a button turn off surveillance capitalism in case of third-party suppliers, not in case of Apple? So it is somehow showing that privacy and surveillance capitalism are incompatible, and taking advantage of this for the own sake of Apple. Am I right to interpret this case in this way?
I'm not 100% sure how you meant this. I'm having issues with the term surveillance capitalism. I want to be clear on that.
I was sure about it.
Because I think it's too easy to assume that the use of data has anything to do with surveillance. Surveillance is a strong word. We are talking about countries that really use surveillance to control their people, right? And targeted advertising and display has nothing to do with it. I mean, the elements, the data, the details that are shared is nothing compared to real surveillance of users. And we shouldn't allow people to put the whole industry under suspicion of somehow surveying their users day in and day out, just because there were some bad examples of some bad players. Now, for the standard effective display advertising in the open display market, you don't need a degree of surveillance that is anyway dodgy. So I certainly believe there is a path that very effective display advertising can work with full adherence to privacy that is, in the end, beneficiary for users, because overall they get more out of the system than less. Now, we've already seen where too much focus on seemingly privacy issues and interest can lead to a concentration of power. A concentration of power that doesn't help anyone because it leads to higher prices. And if you ask user, do you rather have this product at a price of 0 and you share some data about you that is not personal, like gender and your location, very general issues, or do you want to pay for it now 10 euros or whatever? All studies so far suggest I rather have it for free and share this minimum data that enables some personalizing of ads than having to pay ever more. So this balance needs to be kept in mind, and therefore we need to kind of find a way forward that really looks at the core of privacy and what is really a sophisticated, justified concern, while not blocking off all competition, because overall competition may do much more for the society and for users than what we could achieve in terms of additional protection and privacy.
Thank you.
All right. Any last question from the audience? Because if not, I do have a question. 3, 2, 1. All right. Thomas, I was interested also to know if there has also been any other case similar to the ATT case with Apple in the industry so far?
Well, those here will see the resemblance, obviously, to the Google Privacy Sandbox. It's very similar in kind. In both cases, it's about making it more difficult for third parties to access data, combine data for purposes of marketing. So the Privacy Sandbox, as has been investigated by the UK Competition and Market Authority and is currently investigated by the European Commission in the Google AdTech investigation, have very strong similarities with Apple ATT. And in a way, I see it that Apple and Google are actually kind of cooperating here, whether it's with a real agreement or it's just aligned interest. But I think they both have realized we are better off if the focus and the budgets are towards search advertising. So let's weaken display advertising, and the best way to do that is to deprive them of the resources they need, which is third-party data.
All right. Thank you. A warm applause again for Thomas Höppner.
you.